I want to get into the question, but before we get into that, I actually wanted to ask you about the bro split for a second, because I generally do agree with you on most of your opinions as far as like volume is concerned and splits in general, and how it really is kind of like a tertiary factor in my opinion, definitely not primary, regardless of how you want to put it. But I just have one question, and this is kind of on behalf of Coach Aaron.
Yeah.
Like logically, this is just simply logically, not even looking at the data to me. If we were to take like the same amount of volume, I find it hard to believe that it wouldn't improve our performance by just splitting that volume amongst more sessions throughout the week. Not even necessarily like a 7-day arbitrary week, but if you had a total amount of recoverable volume, wouldn't it make more sense to spread that volume out as much as possible in order for it to be as stimulating as possible? Or do you think that fatigue is almost irrelevant to performance for hypertrophy in a sense?
So it's a really good question. So like, again, I'm going to answer this with like, it's kind of a depends thing, right? So there's going to be some people out there that they need frequency because one, they can't really handle too much high volume in one singular session. And the other thing is then they actually might recover fairly well. Like, so you've probably seen the Chris Beardsley infographic, right? With like the different recovery timelines and stuff, right? That's just like a generalization of like quads recover quicker than pecs and things like that. But for some people, pecs actually recover quicker than quads and things. So basically, my big thing with like the bro split is I don't think like it's the best split. So again, if somebody put a gun to my head and was like, hey, like training a muscle one time a week, like you've got to do it, I'd be like, fuck, like it's not the best. But where I kind of like draw a bit of a line is it's how people are explaining it, why it's not the best. So the mechanistic reasoning behind one times training frequency, we're drawing conclusions from legit going to the gym 1 time a week. That's not bro split, right? Yeah. And so we're also then saying that there is no fractional work in any other of the days, which there is. And so like, for example, if I did a bent over row on my back day, I'm getting some passive tension in hamstrings and glutes from the stretch. And so as much as the stretch has become a dirty word, like actually that passive tension does do something. So it's not enough to maybe stimulate massive gains, right? Like you said, like probably a full body every other day if we did run a bro split and that side by side with twins or something, or did unilateral work, which would be kind of hard, but we probably see that the higher frequency group wins, I think, over time. But it's not that the bro split loses because it doesn't do anything. It's just a slower rate of improvement. But there's going to be some genetic freaks out there where they just legit, they can crush like 10 sets in a given session, and then they actually need 5 days recovery. So the fact that they're not doing full body every other day might be the kind of time course there. And that's where that kind of, like you said about like the fatigue and the role of that and recovery and all these variables kind of play into this little bit of a mix. And so there's going to be like, again, people out there where we call them like just high responders or whatever. I have an example of a coach I used to work with. He was like a goalkeeper in soccer. He legit like would train twice a week and just blow up. Like just 2 sessions a week. And he's fucking like jacked 6'5", 280 pounds, like just could have been like a bodybuilder powerlifter type thing, but played soccer, right? And he'd just be like, yeah, I don't lift very often because if I do, I would get too big and I would eventually hit his genetic ceiling and all this kind of thing. So essentially, like, it's going back to that bell curve thing, right? The majority middle probably live in the 2 to 3 times frequency a week. There's a small end of the population that can get away with just training 1 time a week, bro split. And then there's a small end that actually probably needs like 3, 4, 5, 6 exposures potentially. And then it just becomes a dependent factor of if they can recover between sessions. So that's where, again, I don't defend bro split like it's the superior split, it's the best split, the optimal split. You'll never hear those words come out of my mouth. But I don't think it's objectively the worst split because of the reasons that people say. It could be for a lot of people. It's just not the mechanistic reasoning that they've applied to it. And that's where I kind of draw the lines. I can't remember, somebody tagged me in a comment the other day, and this is kind of off topic, but similar thing. It was a Ben Yanes post, and he was talking about kind of scapulohumeral rhythm and depression and lats and teres major. And the logic that he applied to why one was more teres biased and why one was more lat biased was actually incorrect. But the 2 exercises that he said was more teres bias and more lat bias were correct. So the equation he used was wrong. And so like I put it as kin to a math test, right? Like if you do a math test and the teacher says show your workings, well, you got the right answer, but you worked it out wrong. You're going to get marked down on that.
Half credit.
That's kind of, yeah, right. You'll get half credit. So like that's the thing. Like some people sometimes get the answer right, but their actual logic and understanding of the mechanistic reason is wrong. So that's why bro split for me. Like I think we need a little bit more studies to like essentially have what I would consider like true real life programming of bro split and not these 1 times frequency 3x10 type models, which most people aren't doing anyway. You know what I mean?
So I guess my question about the bro split then is, what is an instance that you would rather program somebody 1 times frequency than 2 or 3? Would it be if they can recover from more volume in that 1 session per week than they could in 2 or 3? That would be really the only reason?
Yeah, and newbies, honestly, as much as this sounds like illogical, think about when you're like first trying to learn a new skill, right? If you're trying to learn 7, 8, 9, 10 skills in the same day, go to school, things like that, you maybe only retain 2 or 3 of them. So at least with the bro split, like you just kind of like motor pattern in the same muscle group in a sense. So then it allows not only recovery, so they're definitely going to be maximally recovered, but also it allows the like motor learning patterns to actually develop as well. So one thing that we don't want to do in skill acquisition, right, is too many complex drills too early. And that's the same thing with lifting muscle contracts. You know what I mean? But actually, there's still a learning pattern and skill component to it. So that's where I think a bro split comes in pretty useful for newbies as well, as much as the other splits could also be used for newbies. So it's kind of like this balance. And again, like I've had clients where I've coached them and they purely want to do bro split. So it's finding a way to maximize the bro split. So can you get more chest work in your shoulder day kind of thing? Can you sneak in hamstring work on your back day? You've got bicep in your back day kind of thing. Like, so there's all these like little different things where when we have arm day, for example, like I'll get people doing it in split squat isometric positions. I'll get the kickbacks in a single leg RDL stance, like little things like that, where it's like, again, we're not fully going to get maximal growth of the quads by being sat in a split squat isometric. But for somebody who's relatively untrained, that isometric contraction could be actually pretty potent stimulus. Now, does it take away from the maximal development of the biceps? Absolutely. But year 1, 2, and 3, people are going to make gains whatever they fucking do, sort of thing. So for me, it's one of those where like now once we get to that kind of year 4, 5, 6, that's when we're like starting to really hone in on what the best split is, how much maximal recoverable volume you can do, all these different things, because then that's where it's going to create how quickly you get to your ceiling or not. The first 2 or 3 years, they're really about just motor patterning, and like you're going to get neural adaptations, you're going to get some hypertrophy. It's actually going to be a little bit slower potentially, especially when most people, generally speaking, they start lifting when they're teenagers, right? So there's a maturity element to that as well. So there's all these different factors that go into it. But again, that would be my thought process is like, are we trying to overcomplicate with like a full body every other day maximalist split, right? Like there's too many movement patterns for the person and they only get one little piece of dose of it if it's like 1 or 2 sets. Whereas generally speaking, newbies, they need multiple sets because they warm up into exercises quite a lot and things. So effective reps model, friggin' junk volume, all those sort of things. Actually, newbies probably respond to that a little bit better because it's just a novel stimulus. They'll be sore as well. That's the other thing. You train full body the first day, you're not going to want to come back 2 days later and train. Like you're going to feel a little bit sore.
So this is interesting because I have so many questions based on what you just said. So the first question I have is, would you say that there's like an inherent like cap to the amount of motor learning that we could do at one time? Like there's a limit from the central nervous system itself that prevents us from making so many coordination adaptations at once? Or would you say it's fatigue that prevents those adaptations from all happening at once?
Yeah, this is where we need like the motor learning experts, right? But I think my opinion on that is, right, like we'll see like a downregulation of the central nervous system contribution the more activation we compound. So that's why, again, diminishing returns on sets and things like that exist, right? And so when it comes to then like learning a skill and the motor behavior as well, there is definitely an effect of repetitions, but we just don't know like how many repetitions is the right amount, if you know what I mean. So like coordination for like a soccer player kicking a ball, they have to do passes and it's a lower threshold motor unit test, right? But then now they're having to strike the ball across the field. Now it's a higher threshold motor unit test. And so fatigue comes with that higher intensity action. So I'm not going to be able to do as many repetitions of it because eventually the load and strain will exceed the capacity of what the tissue is and then they get injured, right? So like that's where you can't just go out and kick a soccer ball at maximal intensity 10,000 times on your first ever day of playing soccer. Like you've got to learn how to maximize efficiency in that striking motion as well. But even once you've got efficiency, there's still going to be a load capacity at some point. So these are like, again, little variables that like play together in my opinion. And it's really hard to just say like, the reason why you're not really skillful is because you didn't respond really well to repetition volume or you didn't do enough repetition. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of all this like jumble of things. So that's kind of my like, again, broad perspective of that sort of stuff. Like I'm not a motor learning expert, but that would be my general understanding of those things. And people will say like, you can use visualization tools and things like that, right? And like, imagine you're lifting the weights, imagine you're kicking the soccer ball, essentially learn that skill. And so like, it's a little like kind of movement, right? It's going to start from the brain generally, unless it's totally reflexive, but like you're always having to think about it. So that's where I think there's a massive component of how the mind, obviously not the mind muscle connection in a sense, but the actual thought process of intent towards the movement and how you're going to execute it, you still have to think about it. And then eventually it becomes kind of almost second nature. So it's a little bit less kind of, it's a little bit more programmed and a little less like finding out, if you know what I mean.
And from when I was talking to Ali from Biomechanics Center, I got the impression that like when you make these coordination adaptations, like the nervous system almost like decides what the most efficient pathway is based on the way you've been moving and not really how you intend to move. So like it will just select a start point and an end point and almost find like an average between all of those movements and try to find the most efficient transition point from the beginning to the end phase. Is that accurate or not really?
Yeah, I think so. And again, he'll probably understand it a little better than me because of coming from that biomechanics background. But again, that's where like when you start to go outside of your degrees of freedom of normal, when you have done a specific movement the same way, that's where like soreness creeps in, right? Or like you don't get as many repetitions in a certain lift and things, or you change like the position and go wider grip and all of a sudden the leverage is gone and stuff like that. Like all of these variables, again, the brain wants to do it, but it'll default to kind of what it's been programmed to do. So when it gets outside of the normal, things like your afferent feedback and efferent feedback processes, they change. So it goes, oh, too much strain, shut down. You know, the antagonist works a little bit more. So that's where coordinated effort, and this isn't my biggest area of interest, but like sprinting, right? Like there's a reason why elite sprinters the way that they are. They have some really good genetics, but they've got these locomotion patterns that not one and two sprinters look the same, if you know what I mean. Like Usain Bolt, complete different anthropometry to Tyson Gay or someone else, right? So like these guys, they all have these like specific movement signatures, and there's not like one way of saying this is the optimal way to sprint, but there's multiple different models that make people fast, kind of thing. So similar with lifting, you'll see like because of anthropometry, there's different leverages, external moment arms, things like that, that predispose us to being a little bit better and a little bit worse at these tasks. So then your movement signature, your brain, it's how well that processes information and actually sends the signal to be able to activate the muscle and things. So that's why like individual nuance is like crazy, and that's why it's really hard to say this is the right way to do stuff, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I guess that could probably have implications for neuromechanical matching too, just because based on your own muscles architecture and body structure, like you may be targeting different prime movers doing the same exercise depending on your structure. Could that be like a
Yeah. Again, I think like on that one with like neuromechanical matching, right? Like right now we've taken an example of motor unit behavior from low threshold involuntary tasks. In a sense, there is voluntary respiration, but mostly it's being observed in involuntary. So these kind of things like might not necessarily then transfer to, again, a sprinting action, a maximal lift, a power clean, and stuff like that. Because what like I might use as my like primary mover for a squat, I might be a bit more anterior dominant and use quads. Somebody else may actually be able to sit back, keep a greater trunk position, or have more trunk lean, and now all of a sudden they use the posterior chain and their glutes to get out of the hole a little bit better. So again, I don't think that the body is then going, well, actually the quads are slightly less leveraged and the glutes are slightly more leveraged, and yes, this guy is going to get glute activation. You know what I mean? I think like it's generally where people start to develop these certain areas, and then there's a lot of other things that are at play because your physiological cross-sectional area of a muscle, your pronation angles, your fascicle lengths, your tendon lengths are all different to mine, and we might be exactly the same height, same build, same weight, but you might all of a sudden have these like crazy pronation angles for your biceps, and you can just curl 10 pounds, 20 pounds more than me because I don't have that same type of muscle architecture. So it's less about like, oh, I'm working in the neuromechanical matched range, right? I don't even think like the biceps actually respond, and there's not many muscles that I'm currently aware of that actually the neuromechanical matching, I'm going to call it theorem, applies to so far. We just don't know is really the real answer. But right now, the kind of like we're playing on the absence of presence is not the presence of absence kind of thing. Whereas like it doesn't seem to be pointing in that direction so far. And if it did, I think we'd have a lot more neuromechanical matching resistance training papers. It's a little bit strange to me that now it's 2025 and there's not really one paper that has really done it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
the techniques exist.
And the idea of the nervous system being perfectly tuned for purely metabolic efficiency makes a lot more sense in like lower intensity tasks. But if you were to think about like a 1 rep max, that's probably the worst situation for this idea, just because it would make sense that in a life or death situation, the nervous system would override what's more metabolically efficient in order for us to just get the job done essentially. So that's just something I would like to see. And I think is it possible to test those claims in high effort situations, or does it get kind of shaky when taking measurements in those conditions?
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of it kind of like the long stuff, I think it's topography or whatever the name is. So it's like a bit of an invasive technique, and there's a bit of modeling and estimation that's done. And it's, again, a little bit easier generally to model stuff that's not moving very, very fast, and there's not much excursion. Like the lungs kind of inflate and depress, and they're not doing it at like these large muscle lengths or ranges and things like that. And then also it's generally slow twitch dominant, like you said. So like they're kind of these lower threshold tests. So once like locomotion and dynamic efforts come in, it becomes really difficult to understand like activation patterns. We've probably seen this with like EMG and things like surface EMG, the crosstalk, the potential to like miss specific motor units based on placement and things like that. So we can use like fine wire, we can use HD EMG as well, and get a slightly more accurate signal. The thing is though, then that's just like one layer and level of like, okay, we're understanding like the activation pattern, but then this is where kind of my thought process comes in with neuromechanical matching and then hypertrophy is like, it's not just the activation that's important here, but it's actually the internal fiber force and the muscle forces that are being created. And those two things are not always matched together. So essentially what we'd have to do, right, is we'd have to do both a mechanistic study and a outcome study where you essentially get people to train in the best relative leverage ranges and then measure some of these things like ultrasound, so looking at fascicle behavior, length changes, things like that, getting fine wire EMG and things to get the activation patterns. And we're probably going to have to do it on things like the biceps first, in a sense, because it's kind of a bit more of a straight up and down muscle, and it's two joint and biarticular in a sense, so two joint, yeah. And so then it's real simple.
It's a prime candidate for neuromechanical matching, no?
Say that again, sorry?
It's kind of like a prime candidate for neuromechanical matching.
I mean, a lot of people think it is, but then it actually, like, when you like see the way that the authors and things, like the Hudson paper in 2019, define what would be the characteristics of neuromechanical matching, actually the brachialis would make more sense to be the prime candidate, except for when it comes to leverage across the whole of the elbow flexion. It's the lowest leverage one of all three of the prime elbow flexors. So that one already kind of is like, well, it makes no sense. And then the other thing is it's also related to tendon compliance and things like that. And then the length tension relationship. So these other things like that come into play generally would probably point that it isn't neuromechanical matching. That is the reason why activation happens. So the reason why a brachialis is activated first or is the primary kind of contributor to load in an elbow flexion is because one, it's primarily made up of slow twitch, so lower threshold motor unit. So type 1, exactly. So they're going to be recruited earlier in a contraction anyway. They're already semi-active during rest sort of thing. If you're just hanging out there, there's still some low, kind of think of a dimmer switch in a sense.
It's like the primary elbow flexor.
Yeah, it's a pure elbow flexor. And the thing is, the kind of fascicles, it has kind of a little bit more sarcomeres in series, so it can operate over a larger muscle length, and that's why we don't really see as too much of a drop-off in the load share of a brachialis versus like a biceps, which we know there is some active insufficiency that happens in the super contracted position because it doesn't really like to be at those lengths. But we can still get some muscle force there. It's just we have to then change the way the resistance profiles are and things. So this is the thing with like neuromechanical matching for me is I think we just talked about it earlier, but it's that where people get it right in a sense by applying the wrong equation. So in some cases, right, like the best relative leverage for biceps is somewhere down in that lower portion. Biceps generally trains and adapts on the ascending limb, so ascending wrist distance curves, things like that. We're going to get some response there. And so if we purely train our biceps in these like shortened positions, we're not going to get anything, right? So it's like we're playing on the length tension relationship and the force velocity relationship of the muscle. And so training in those positions is going to get us somewhat of the way, but it's not because of the reason that the biceps is recruited because of its relative leverage, if that makes sense.
So it actually seems like it's relatively hard to bias the biceps of all the elbow flexors, just relatively because of the weird function they seem to have.
But again, think of like the brachialis as like the powerhouse of elbow flexion, but the kind of ways of biasing the biceps versus not biasing the biceps. And I honestly don't like using the word biased, and I always generally just say distribution of load share. Yeah. But then people will say, well, that means it's biasing it a little bit more. Okay, whatever. It's semantics at that point, right? But we're not truly biasing it because it doesn't have the biggest piece of the pie. But essentially,
relative piece of the pie, though, maybe it might have.
Yeah, it'll increase its relative piece of the pie when you do supination, because there's certain muscle fibers that respond to both elbow flexion primarily and then supination. And so this goes back like way before even I was born to some papers in the 80s where essentially like the motor unit recruitment dropout and pooling, some motor units only responded when they were in the supinated position. So that's where, again, when we've like looked at these like different ways of biasing, you generally see that the brachioradialis, neutral pronation, generally gets a slight upregulation in its load share, where the biceps decreases, and that's because some of the fascicles are purely supinators in the biceps. And so that's why now people are doing supinations, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, I'm never really going to ever say there's redundant exercises because I'm sure that you probably can get a little bit of load there and like probably stimulate something. But the thing is, like, that is one of the ones where when we are in supination and we elbow flex, those fascicles are operating at the kind of like lengths and tensions that they need to operate at and doing the rolls that they need to do. So if we just purely do supinators, we kind of waste our time where we just didn't hit the elbow flexors, if that makes sense, the fascicles that will be pure elbow flexors. So you can just get it by doing a supinated curl. Bang for buck, right? And then if you really want to dial into those details, maybe there's some forearm stuff that you get in your supination versus actually your biceps. But anyway, that's a different story. But again, that's where a lot of my like most recent videos on TikTok and things like that have kind of focused around the elbow flexors, and that's an area that I think everybody wants big biceps, right? But I also see lots of little creators get these things wrong because it'll be like, hey, the top half of a standard bicep curl is brachioradialis biased, and no, it's not. It's just that the biceps load share is still there. It just drops off because of the wrist resistance profile, and breacher curl is even worse for that because we've now gone into shoulder flexion. So again, there's a little bit of length changes, but the length changes for biceps and brachioradialis generally are at the tendons. So the muscle length itself, it's not like getting super stretched, which is another misconception of like throwing your arm back into an incline curl. It's actually most of the length is just the tendon wrapping around the humeral head and the shoulder. So basically, like the biceps itself actually doesn't really lengthen too much. So you don't see the fascicles change too much, and they also have pretty long fascicles as well. So that's the other reason, kind of differences with the brachialis and the biceps is the fascicle lengths are slightly different, and the biceps has more type 2 fibers, so higher threshold, so we need higher activations.
So when you would argue that if you wanted to bias the biceps as much as possible, you would want to have a slightly flexed shoulder, right?
So some data on this, and I'm completely blanking on the authors' names now, but there's been 3 papers that I'm aware of that essentially they looked at the different shoulder positions, and then they looked at the resistance curves. And essentially, if you were in around about 70 degrees of shoulder flexion, so like if we have, I don't know if you can see that, but if we have 90 here, right, a little lower, seems to have higher activity for the biceps, and it's probably because the short head and its tendon slightly change in terms of its length tension relationship. So that could point towards being that there's more kind of biceps there. But we generally think that with increased shoulder flexion positions, we shorten the biceps. But this is kind of the thing, right? The biceps, in a sense, is a shoulder flexor down here, but it's not so much up here. And there's actually not too much length change happening. But it does seem that when it goes past 90, like it has no capacity to create, or less capacity to create torque. So it's kind of like this like torque curve where at lower joint angles and then higher joint angles of shoulder flexion, the torques drop off. And then there seems to be this middle ground between the like 70-ish degrees of shoulder flexion where it seems to get EMG activity again. But then we've also got to consider the resistance profile of the exercise, right? Because if I go to 70 degrees, and this might not be perfect 70 degrees, but if I go to 70 degrees on a preacher bench and I curl a dumbbell like this, well, in this top range here, my line of action is stacked right over the joint. I don't need to contract. I can contract and I can tense, right? But there's no real need for active tension anymore because you could just sit like this for a long time. In a sense, it's more so going to be taken up by some of the shoulder stabilizers and the rotator cuff to keep the arm in that position. You don't need to keep your elbow flexed. Like the biceps don't need to be flexing the elbow. The brachialis doesn't need to be flexing the elbow and brachioradialis. So we have to play on gravity and the line of action. And so that's where that kind of concentration curl, I think some of the people in the comments are calling it the freaky curl that I've got, where you lean over the preacher bench, get your shoulder into that 70 degrees. Now, when you're in that 90 degree elbow flexion angle and more, the line of action, you've still got a lot of gravity pushing down on the external moment arm. So the internal torque and the internal joint forces are going to be slightly higher. So it's one of these where, I forget where I saw this term, I think it was like Shirley Salmon or somebody's research where it's called form closure. And this is where joints just kind of like stack on each other with gravity. So there's no need for the muscle to create force or force closure in a sense. It'd just be form closure because gravity's acting down on us. And that's why, like, even at rest in a sense, like our body doesn't fall apart because there's slight form and force closure kind of happening. So the muscles are active and things like that. So that's where basically I think that it'd be the best way to do an optimized bicep curl, because the other part of it is now we're getting more resistance over a greater profile of the fascicle length tension relationship versus these other curves, kind of like curls variations. They play on either side of the ascending or descending limb. And so it doesn't fully get optimal, but it gets a piece of the pie, right? And that's where I said again, like some of these things get it right, and they'll get you some arm development, but they might not be the necessary quote unquote optimal curl kind of thing.
So would you say almost like calling it active insufficiency, why the biceps lose force production at higher degrees of flexion?
No, I would say that the likelihood is that active insufficiency happens for the biceps, but I also think that we can reduce it based on the resistance profile. So again, we need some form of place where the joint still has to create tension in those deeper ranges of flexion. Now, don't get me wrong, brachioradialis is still playing a role in there. Brachialis is still playing a role at deeper elbow flexion ranges. But again, we very rarely, if ever, do a bicep curl where we come all the way back here, right? Like, there's just no point. The reason being is that we don't need to actively create force anymore. Gravity does its job for us, and momentum probably takes us there too. So basically, yeah, there's going to be a point at which active insufficiency comes in because we just won't be able to form cross bridges based on the contracted, super shortened position. And that's why we see the kind of drop-offs in the length tension relationship where at certain fascicle lengths, there just is no force at all. Like, it can't produce anything.
So the only thing that's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around is the difference between having your shoulder flexed on, say, a preacher curl versus like hanging forward. And I understand kind of what you were saying, but would you say that having your arm hanging would reduce the biceps involvement as a shoulder flexor or increase it compared to having it hanging on a preacher bench? It would be reducing it, right?
So you're saying that if you put it onto a preacher bench?
If you were to hang as opposed to put it on a preacher bench, you would be reducing the biceps involvement with shoulder flexion.
Yeah, for sure. But again, like, have you ever kind of like done the preacher where you like try and cheat it and you see kind of like your shoulder sorts and moves back? Now, I actually think potentially, and I had this conversation with Juan a little while ago. I think that's one of the reasons that the dumbbell incline curl actually shows similar growth stimulus to a preacher curl. Because I think that when people initiate that curl, they actually use the bicep as a shoulder flexor. So in terms of being hung down, the thing is, you kind of like joint stability is coming from like kind of more of the posterior muscles rather than the anterior. So the biceps doesn't have to do its role. And so as much as you've got the arm rested and you think, oh, okay, the biceps doesn't have to have a role in shoulder flexion either. The problem is in this area, right, is that resistance curve because of the line of action and gravity. So flipping over and being bent over, my resistance curve, I've got gravity acting against the dumbbell, or in this case, cables can maybe solve the preacher curl arm rested a little bit better than a dumbbell version or a barbell bench. But if we bend over, the gravity is acting against the dumbbell over a larger range. Whereas, like I said, in the preacher, we're going to end up in this kind of elbow position at some point, and we'll get form closure.
So could that issue somewhat be solved if I had like a adjustable resistance profile preacher curl? Because I have a prime preacher curl at like my gym. So
Yeah.
what I usually do actually to emulate. So before we had this conversation, to emulate that curl that you showed on your TikTok, I was going on the prime plate loaded preacher curl and then adjusting the resistance profile so it was peaking like literally at 90 degrees of elbow flexion, and then I had my shoulder flexed about 60 to 70 degrees. And actually to like reduce any type of instability, this might be overkill, but I seatbelt my arm onto the preacher curl pad. So would that still be considered like a
Yeah.
version of that exercise?
Yeah, and so that's how those researchers actually did perform that exercise, was in like the isokinetic dynamometer machine, and at least one of the papers I remember. And so yeah, you're kind of strapped in, you're seat belted in, and things like that. It's honestly it is getting that change in preacher. So if you don't have one where you can adjust the resistance profile, and plate loaded ones are really really good, but if you don't have that option, like you're kind of screwed. The easiest way to do it is the video that I put out, where it's just get a dumbbell, get a cable, bend over, and make it look freaky, but it'll get you a pretty long way. And the other thing that I would say is like a lot of times, right, like most people generally start their fitness journeys with standard curl, and they'll probably do an alternating, they'll probably do a hammer, and they'll probably stood up, or they might just sit down because they get tired. So like these exercises also become a bit more of a novel stimuli. So that's also another bit of potential for biceps and just arm growth in general, is because you haven't done it before. And so not only is it quote unquote potentially optimal, it's also a novel stimulus. So that's where like I think again, when people switch from Bayesian curls to preacher curls or incline curl to a different kind of curl, they like still see some production and growth, and it's because they've just started to play on a different part of the resistance curve kind of thing.
Do you think there's utility to swapping exercise simply for like motor learning purposes after a certain amount of time? Like, can improving skill and coordination make a lift less hypertrophic because you're using less neural drive per rep?
That's a really good question. I think there's definitely utility into variation. We don't want too much variation, right? Because we want to keep going back to the same movement patterns that get us the best bang for buck. But as an example, and this is more of a personal preference and choice, like right now I very rarely do any weighted pull-ups. And I actually think weighted pull-ups are a really great exercise to develop the back musculature and develop the lats. But I actually use the other exercises like pull downs and flaps and things like that. And I use the pull-ups as my kind of like, does it strengthen things transfer? So now I'm kind of retesting that. My next training block when I'm in off season, I'll actually throw weighted pull-ups back in. But you can get development and you can go quite a long way with a certain given exercise. And that's the other thing, is like, I think there can be like too much paralysis by analysis of adding too many different exercises in the program and trying to get everything in sort of thing. So this is where people love the optimal, right? Like they want the best, they want the easiest way to kind of like put in the program, do it, I'm going to get my best bang for it. And so there are going to be certain exercises that are going to get us that, but it also depends on some of the range of motions and kind of the loads, intensities, how much you can progress it, and also some of your anthropometry as well. So to answer that kind of second part of like, could you get like too efficient at learning something? That's a kind of interesting question again that I don't have like the best answer for, but I would imagine that if you are really highly skilled in a certain area, I would then start to see like plateaus, right? Like your ceiling is going to be somewhere at some point. We've got choices. At that point, we've got programming decisions to make. So is it set extension techniques like drop sets, myo reps, rest pauses? Is it cluster reps? Those type of methodologies that can help us change like what the intensities and things that we're exposed to that might help break some plateaus. Is it throw in a deload? Like see if actually some of our response is actually not what we think, where it's like the motor pattern is really good, but actually we've got maybe fatigue masking some of our performance outcomes. Pretty unlikely, but potential. And then the other option is, let's go and do something now that challenges that same system, but in a slightly different way. We can come back to the old one, but it's kind of like the back squat example, right? Back squat can get you pretty good quad development and pretty good lower body development, but at a certain point, it's going to have diminishing returns because it's a less stable movement pattern, and there's a lot more things that can go wrong, and there's a little bit more global fatigue associated to it. So then you see people gravitate towards hack squat or pendulum squat, these more stable squat patterns, and then they see greater leg growth again because now we've created some stability. We're doing the same or similar movement pattern, but maybe just in slightly different ways. So I'm always kind of a big fan of like, you finding the exercises that you can basically start and then ultimately progressively overload the most, and they're going to get you the best bang for buck outcomes because the force generation is going to be there every time that you progressively overload. And we can maybe get into progressive overload, but like that doesn't mean adding intensity every single week, but there should be a ceiling of intensity that's quite wide. So a good example would be inverted row, right? Inverted rows are kind of hard. They're a pretty tough exercise to do. You're acting against gravity in the row, but they're also really freaking hard to load. So it's not a great exercise because at some point I can't stack 100 kgs on my chest, you know what I mean, to get more load there. Whereas I could just go to a low row machine or a cable stack or something like that, do exactly the same movement pattern and hit more than 100 kgs. So that's where like some exercises that I know the tier list exists and stuff, like some are just going to be S tier because they have the variables of being able to progressively overload and have a greater capacity. So they're going to get you a longer way kind of thing.
So So if adding an exercise doesn't lead to like an increase in motor unit recruitment, my natural like thought would be that the only thing that adding that exercise would do would be requiring you to spend a decent amount of time relearning that motor pathway, right? So like would inherently just changing the exercise cause more progression, or would the exercise have to lead to an increase in motor unit recruitment somehow? Like, do you think maybe switching from a more stable exercise to a less stable exercise could ever have utility, or probably not?
Yeah, I think it definitely works both ways on the spectrum, right? Again, there's probably going to become a more motor learning pattern with the less stable exercise because now we've just introduced more of like a vestibular stimulus, we've introduced proprioception, like other things that now require us to again learn a motor pattern of efficiency. Now, the thing is, I don't think that it's going to take that long to do it, but there might come with a point of, I guess, diminishing returns if like how fast you can progressively load it. So a good example of that, right, is if you're like training a Olympic lifter and they have a really good front squat, they should be able to catch clean in the bottom position. But if it's their first time ever doing a first pull and second pull from the floor, right? Like they've only ever hang clean, for example, like they're not going to be able to do the loads as effectively from the floor because they just haven't learned that motor pattern yet. So there's going to be a point in the training where you're kind of learning the skill, but then that would mean that you have to get your intensity from somewhere else. So it might be that you still keep your compounds in there, and that's why Olympic lifters generally squat quite a lot and things like that. And they'll do deadlifts and stuff. But again, like the transference of skills, like how long is long enough to learn it? Some people pick Olympic lifting up in 2 weeks. Other people it takes them months. So there's going to be a point of diminishing returns in terms of how quickly we can load and do some of these things. So when it comes to hypertrophy, that's why we gravitate towards isolated muscle patterns and stability, because it's really easy to get into a machine and just start lifting.
But the reason why you would usually implement an isolation exercise would be because it just has a way higher chance of stimulating the target musculature, not inherently because it's more total neural drive being sent to that muscle compared to a compound, right? Because that's a big point of contention I see on in the internet right now. And I was talking to Ali from Biomechanics Center about this, and I've really been trying to get to like as much of a concrete answer as I can. I know it's very hard, but there's kind of like two schools of thought. One of which argues that like in a compound, say the agonist were to become the limiting factor and reach task failure, it would not be as maximally recruited compared to say in an isolation where it doesn't have to compete for neural drive. The other side of that argument would argue that there isn't a cap to the amount of neural drive that the central nervous system can use at one time, and it may be task dependent in the sense that the more muscles are involved in an action, the more neural drive that may totally be able to be sent.
So the way like I kind of approach this question and my thought processes around it, right, is again, it comes back to kind of what are going to be the primary movers and the reasons why they're going to be primary movers in a task. So there's always going to be task specificity to muscle recruitment because we're not going to have the primary mover be a bicep when we're doing a squat. If you know what I mean? And like that's an obvious thing that people know. But like take the squat then as like a compound exercise, right, where there is that utility of requirement for more stabilization. The thing is, once intensities get high enough, like the central nervous system and motor unit recruitment, it's going to be an all hands on deck approach. So it's not going to be like sending a signal again to the biceps, which might be doing a little bit of a contraction by holding the bar there, but its primary signal and strength is going towards the primary target tissue. Now, the thing is, we don't necessarily need a muscle to be activated fully for it to hit its peak force in a given lift. So that's kind of a bit of a misconception that comes with some of this thought process of motor unit recruitment. It has to be active for it to produce force. So there has to be an activation. So a non-active fiber can't produce anything. But the thing is, we don't have to maximally activate something and get maximal motor unit recruitment to necessarily see a peak force value get hit. And Tyler Collins did some work on this within the glutes, where the hip thrust has the maximal amount of MVC in terms of EMG activity. But actually, the split squat was the one that produced the highest peak force with with an average amount of MVC for the glute max. So activation is going to get us somewhere, and there's a bit of an uncoupling between activation and force. But the thing is, once the intensity gets high enough, it is all hands on deck. So motor unit recruitment, all available threshold fibers, small and large, so your fast twitch, slow twitch, they're all going to be recruited. So essentially, no, it goes fucking ham. I think I forget what we said earlier, but essentially the brain is not now thinking about efficiency. It's about thinking, can I survive kind of thing. And so the survival instinct with the sympathetic nervous system is, all right, we got to friggin' get all of our troops in this case being our motor units, recruited, and they have to work, because otherwise I can't sustain the force. So then there's also the afferent feedback process that's then saying, hey, this force is too much. There's too much stretch on the Golgi tendon organ. There's too much stretch on the muscle spindles. And then we get activation and coactivation of the antagonist. And that's where we see that now we stop actually contracting the muscle and we get less neural drive, and then we fatigue and fail. So that's one of the processes. There's also other things that play with the fatigue and stuff. But essentially, a high enough intensity contraction, you're going to max out motor unit recruitment. And so that's my general understanding of that, whether that's in an isolation or in a compound. And that's why we don't always see these massive outcome differences between these two types of different lifts.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me just think about that for a second.
No, you're good. I know I just said a lot, so yeah, if there is any other kind of like questions on that, I can expand.
Yeah,
But
just
that again is kind of my.
because obviously my problem is drawing the line. That's always been my problem with these kind of questions. Is like, obviously there is a point where if we were to find some type of a full body press exercise, right, where you're somehow contracting as many motor units as possible across the whole body, that whatever the limiting factor is, we would assume that it would receive less of a stimulus than if we were to just do a single joint exercise for that muscle. Would that make sense? But my problem
Yeah.
is drawing that line between where like synergist being involved may not limit stimulus, but may actually help with stimulus. And like that's the problem is like where we really like. Do you have a clear idea of where we draw that line between how compound an exercise could be while still providing a lot of utility for hypertrophy?
Yeah, so this is where the in vivo load share becomes the important factor to consider, right? Because the primary mover that's taking the most of the load share is creating generally the most piece of the pie of the force, so it's going to get adaptation, it's going to get a mechanical signal. Now, the thing is, like, if we go back to that, yeah, so let's go back to the elbow flexor example, right? Brachialis, biggest piece of the load share, yet generally speaking, people don't talk about like how big their brachialis is, right?
Yeah.
They normally say, look at my biceps. And so what we've also got to consider there is with the synergists of the biceps and the brachioradialis is their kind of amenability to actually grow. So because they're made up of type 2 fibers and things like that, they have a higher potential for cross-sectional area changes compared to the brachialis, which is already a pretty big physiological cross-sectional area muscle, but it's made up of slower twitch fibers, which don't hypertrophy the same way. So this is kind of where some of these synergists and things like that, I think that what the kind of question becomes, and I get a lot of flack for this online, is a question of like how much volume load that direct muscle group is getting. So that's what, at least with isolations, it makes it really easy to quantify the direct volume load because we're like, target muscle group, this is the only thing involved, this is what's happening. When we start adding complexity in compounds, there's more things at play. So those fractions, how much of that fraction actually is impactful? And so that's where, again, it comes back to the load share. So I kind of talked about this, I think, but like if somebody's a little bit stronger in their glutes in a squat, then the glutes are going to be, gives more force production out of the hole. But that doesn't mean the quads aren't going to adapt. But it might mean that when they go and do a leg extension for quads, when isolate the quads, they might get better hypertrophy responses. So that's kind of like a little bit of a complexity thing where I don't have like the like, okay, there's X fractional work for squat with the glutes because some people have higher EMG activities and force output, some people have lower. All then comes back down to like their composition, their genetics, their fiber types, their tendon lengths, their fascicle lengths. It's all and their training age, like how long they've trained for and things. But ultimately, what I would kind of say is my simplistic answer is it's going to be the exercise that can get you the most volume load for the thing that you're trying to achieve. So if it was quads and you can do and handle a couple more sets of leg extensions than you can of doing back squats because you're metabolically fatigued easier in compounds and things like that, and the transient fatigue in a session, it drops off, you lose motivation, you can't hit 3 sets, but you can easily hit 4 sets of leg extensions. That's going to be the exercise that's going to get you the best bang for buck kind of thing.
Right. I think that's very interesting because it actually brings like it makes me think about how you were kind of talking on your page about how like the whole reason why coaches exist is because of this like individuality to fitness, and that like the best exercise, the most optimal program is truly dependent on the individual, and that's the whole reason why people like you and I have careers. And I find it to be interesting how there are some creators like maybe we should name them, but that kind of like treat fitness in such a way, such a cookie cutter way, where you can kind of just apply this basic foundation to all of your training, and it oversimplifies it so much to the point where it kind of removes the value of what these people are trying to sell, if that makes sense. Like it's very confusing to me how you're taking to the internet to try to educate people on training, and in reality you're kind of indoctrinating them more and more to think that it's less complicated than it really is, and I feel like that's counterproductive to the whole thing that you're trying to sell, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's a tough challenge, right? Because the one thing where like I generally get alarm bells, and this isn't just being as a PhD, but just like my coaching hat in a sense, is when somebody is like, okay, a certain exercise or a certain split, this is the best, this is the optimal. It generally means they haven't really coached people. Yeah. It's like they've done it themselves. Oh, it worked. Wow, I'm an N of 1. And then you give them an N of 1 that contrasts their views, and it's like, no, my way's the best. And it's like, but I just gave you this example where this other way worked, and then it's like, nah, it's impossible. This has to be objectively the best. And then suddenly it then becomes like, oh, mechanisms. And then the thing that I'll say is that like even like some of the mechanisms that I've explained so far, like we still don't have a full grasp and understanding of all of the intricacies of mechanisms that are at play, because again, like there's like these little bits of nuance that people don't really consider. And so I'll keep reiterating these, but it always comes down to like muscle architecture in a sense. Like a muscle on average has a certain fascicle length on average because we've cut up people, all people, cadavers, and we've measured these things and then we've modeled them. And the thing is, what we know with all people is they generally have sarcopenia, so they have reductions in potentially their fascicle length and things like that, and like the number of sarcomeres they have in series, but also the muscle shrinks, the cross-sectional area. So are these actually reflective of Mr. Olympia, who is super jacked and super massive and is training, and obviously there's PEDs involved in that. But then also average Joe as well, who's pretty muscular. The thing is, like, a good example is the fascicle length in the calves, right? Because we'll go full circle here and come back to neuromechanical matching. The medial gastroc is used as the example of why neuromechanical matching exists, because they took the leverage data, so passive joint range of motion and passive torque, and then they took fascicle length data from another study, and they kind of mapped those two things, those ranges, so how much recruitment and how much force was being produced at a certain range and what the measured fascicle length should be. Problem with that is, each individual, we can have like up to 4 different differences in fascicle length in the medial gastroc for individuals. So if I measured your fascicle length, but then used my force and EMG activity for plantar flexion, that wouldn't make sense. That isn't very scientific. And so, again, not to ramble on about neuromechanical matching, but another reason why the soleus is recruited first is 1, it's monoarticular, and 2, it's made up of quite a lot of slow twitch fibers. So it's going to be recruited because it's lower threshold. So these 30% MVCs are not challenging that soleus as much as a 90% MVC would. And anyway, so that's kind of where I think like what we have to consider is, this is why I think people and individual responses and differences in studies exist, because you can do the same intervention and see 2 complete opposite outcomes, and then it's like, well, did it work? Did it not work? Well, yeah, it worked for some people, and then it didn't work for some other people, and that's coaching for me.
Is this the Kawakami paper you're talking about?
Yeah, so yeah, exactly.
So I actually have a question about that specific paper that always confused me when reading it. Like, the way that they determined, we spoke about this in the podcast with Aaron, but the way they determined mechanical advantage was length change. It wasn't internal momentum length. So I'm confused as to how Beardsley took length change as definition of mechanical advantage, and how did he get the conclusion? How did he change? I guess how did he come to the conclusion that the real determinant for mechanical advantage is internal momentum length as opposed to length change, which is what was measured in the Kawakami paper?
I think it's just a misinterpretation on his part, and not having a deeper understanding of the differences of like that methodology that was applied. And then not to his defense, but this is also in some published research publications as well. So there is, I think, a Cassiano study. I think it's related to the quads, where they talk about they reference the Hudson paper, and then they talk about relative leverage and internal moment. But that's not the same thing, kind of thing. So yeah. I'm not sure exactly where, like, again, unfortunately I can't have conversations with this individual because they have me blocked on everything. It'd be interesting to understand, but this is again a good example of where like scientists sort of thing can get it wrong, right? And so I would do kind of what like Juan does and a couple of other people out there, where it's like, let's go speak to the authors, right? Like, what do they say? And then when they say, well, this is the methodology and this is how we do it and this is how it transfers, probably shouldn't then start extrapolating that and then literally dying on the sword that that's definitely the way that it is. We can maybe make an inference, right? And say, hey, you know what? Maybe actually the internal arm length might be important. Leverage might be a factor, which it is. Muscle leverage is definitely a factor in recruitment and force production, because if a muscle had 0 leverage, it's not going to produce force, which is very rare. Muscle leverage has 0 leverage. But again, this is where I think like we can extrapolate findings, but then we can't like make it sound like it's gospel. Long story short on that one, again, it's misapplication of methods. And like I said, it's weird how those researchers haven't extrapolated any of their findings to like true skeletal muscle resistance training type work, seeing as they're interested in proving neuromechanical matching exists. I mean, it seems a little bit suspect for me, because if I was a scientist, a young scientist who was doing a PhD and that was my area of interest, and then like maybe they've just gone all in on lungs, right? But then if you're starting to get questions about, hey, does it matter in resistance training? You probably start to investigate it. So I'd imagine in the next 5 years, there's going to be some studies come out. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see what people think in terms of the internal moment length and relative leverage, because then it would sort of like invalidate some of the other principles that we've already known and established. So it's kind of like one of those where it may have a little role for certain things and certain tasks. I think one of the things they do is the index finger thing, right? Like this is so low threshold, you could do this all day. Yeah. And that's not the same. That's not the same as lifting a dumbbell and squatting and things like that.
And that's also like the finger flexors are the most tuned for fine motor control. They're the most used in lower intensity situations. They're built to be used all the time. Like, it's very similar to the calves in that sense. Yeah, I think it's this also, I was kind of wondering about the glutes as well when you brought them up. So you said that generally we see that the glutes are more highly activated in like a hip thrust compared to like a split squat or like a deep squat. Would you rather, if you had to maximize hypertrophy of the glutes, I'm assuming you're obviously just going to program both, but if you had to pick one to maximize glute hypertrophy, are you going to pick the more lengthened position just purely because of the length-tension relationship, or do you think the higher degrees of activation may be more relevant in just the glutes hypertrophy?
Yeah, so the glutes are a little bit of a confusing one, because there's a bit of contrasting findings in terms of like where exercises have created hypertrophy and not. And so it seems to lean into the descending limb. So there seems to be some potential for like stretch-mediated hypertrophy for the glutes, right? Training at longer muscle lengths and having passive tension play a role in the overall tension created in a specific exercise. So I really find it hard to just pick one because if I did pick one and I was going glute max, it would be a hip thrust. And we have obviously data to show that it is active and it creates force. And it just, again, it's one of those ones where the best relative leverage of it is in that maximal hip extended position. So it's one of those ones where neuromechanical matches go, oh, this is the reason why. But the thing that I give like as an example of this is like the drawbridge that collapses inwards. So in the flex position and in like the more stretch position, there isn't a force like reason for passive tension to be created because we kind of sit into our joint a little bit. Now, if we like kind of flip that same position and put it into a squat, now because gravity is acting down on us, although counter nutation has happened and we are sat in our pelvis and stuff, there's just that slight more force that's being created there. And well, actually, I say slight, it's actually a moderately amount more. So basically, people can kind of hang out, and you can almost hang out all day in a glute bridge in that position. But in the bottom like quarter of a squat, like you start to fail, and it generally is the quads, the knee flexors, and knee extenders, should I say. So like basically, with that kind of mindset, again, like the paper from the Collins study, like activation is one thing, but then muscle fiber force is a different thing. And so you have to do really, really, really high intensities with hip thrusts, and that's why we can put 5-6 plates on a hip thrust machine, and we can still rep it out for 10. So the limiting factor with my hip thrust is generally I can't get enough load out of it at some point. You can't. You need to get gym pin extenders and things.
Calibrate plates.
Right, exactly. So now all of a sudden, like you need these modifications for the exercise, and we talked earlier about like the ceiling, right? That lower ceiling, it has such a high ceiling. It's a great exercise. So then where else can I train my glutes? Well, we can train it in the lengthened position in the squat. So the thing that I always say is whenever someone says like, okay, what's the best way to train glutes? Do the hip thrust, because then what I would say is like sneakily for the quads, I'd say do a squat.
Yeah, and then
so you train the glutes.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But then people will be like, well, okay, what about knee extension? And so leg extension is also probably in your program for quads too. But you can get quite a lot of good quad, especially vasti muscles development from squats. And there still can be rec fem depending on how you perform that squat as well. So that's like the confusion I think that comes there sometimes with that is like the squats can't train the rectus femoris because of the length changes, but not all squat patterns have the same amount of length changes at the hip and with hip flexion and extension. So again, we can play on some of these things to potentially create more or less load share there. And the rec fem always works in conjunction with the vasti anyway. That's why again, like I think the neuromechanical matching argument always becomes like, well, there is no competition for the quads for knee extension with like the relative forces and things like that, so relative leverage because they're all knee extenders. But the thing is, where this kind of like comes and now all makes sense is now what kind of like people have done is they've gone, well, the best relative leverage would actually be where the knee extension torque is the lowest. So our internal fiber forces and our internal muscle force is also going to be low, whereas where relative leverage isn't as high, and so around about this kind of like 80-ish degrees, 90-ish degrees of knee flexion position, that's where joint torque is the highest. So basically the internal fiber force is shared across the muscle groups. It's not like a four-way share, but it like perfectly proportional, but like the share is kind of all these pieces of the pie, right? And let's pretend it was all just quarters. Like all four of the heads are creating more force at that position, and it's got less leverage. But then they'll say, well, there is no competition for the leverage of the different quads. But the thing is, the highest and longest internal moment arm comes with the lowest amount of joint torque. So that's another kind of where we disband neuromechanical matching there, because it wouldn't make any sense to just train in where the position where the internal moment arm length is the longest.
And I also get a little bit confused when the same people who will talk about neuromechanical matching will make the argument that the rec fem isn't being worked in a squat due to the fact that there's not length change. But I thought the whole point is that length change is kind of irrelevant for stimulus as far as neuromechanical matching is concerned. So like, wouldn't the length not changing like not even be a factor in whether or not the rec fem gets recruited according to people who believe in neuromechanical matching?
Yeah, that's kind of like the point, right? Is that like it's a moment arm length at some point should be relatively pretty long, but then it either does or doesn't get a stimulus. So this is kind of like the thing where what's going to play a bit more of a role in that is, especially in the squat position, is somebody's femur length torso length relationship. Because if they have to hinge more, they have to get more hip flexion, right? And so that's going to shorten a lot more and have a bit more of a impact in the length changes of the rec fem compared to somebody who actually can maintain a bit more upright torso and they stay in a bit more extended position. So I forget the name of the authors, but there's a safety bar study out there that actually showed that the rec fem did grow. I believe it was distal growth, but I can't remember completely. And so one of the reasons for that was, or like it was kind of like the middle belly, so like more distal proximal, is in a safety bar squat, you generally keep a little bit more of an upright torso in most general people. There is kind of like this powerlifter version that I do see sometimes, but in general, like these are like kind of like untrained recreational people. They normally keep a more upright trunk position. So again, if you limit the depth of what they squat, then they don't get as much hip flexion. So that's where, again, like the rec fem will still have some involvement. Now, if I did kind of like the low bar squat where I have to really, really trunk lean, I don't think there is a paper on this, but you're going to get a little bit less because you're getting into such deep angles of hip flexion. So that's like another reason is like the same exercise can be performed in so many different ways where it can target musculature in slightly different ways too. And then obviously it depends on, again, some of the composition of the person's quads in the first place, how they're going to respond, because how they stabilize the hip.
So could there be, I know I'm asking you, I know we're getting towards the end of, the amount of time that we have, but I am curious because this kind of reminds me of like synergies a little bit, like how flexible is the nervous system's use of synergies, and can like isolation style training like rewire or change what synergists are active during certain movements? Like, could you possibly change what's being recruited in a squat in spite of your biomechanics, or do you think that we don't really have too much room to change what the prime mover is going to be in more compound exercises?
Yeah, again, it's like I kind of alluded to earlier, the physiological cross-sectional area is going to be one of the primary determinants of why a muscle is there or not. Muscle leverage is also still important, right? Like, because what we can do is the biceps example that we gave, but even the glute leverage in a sense, right? Like, if we put the glutes in a certain position where they can't create a hip extension torque, like all of a sudden, like they're not going to be well leveraged. I'm trying to think of a type thing, but maybe like a hip flexion cable pull, if you know what I mean. Like, there's not too much glute there when you're getting back into the hip extended position and things. So like, there's definitely ways that we can manipulate things, right? And that's where I think people have confused neuromechanical matching and the relative length of the internal moment arm as like this other factor of muscle leverage, which is how much it can contribute in a certain position. So I think like probably my best example of this would be the lats, because I think there's a lot of confusion around the lats, right? Like, higher up we go, we know that it loses leverage. The thing is, we get to this position and we go, well, the lats can't produce any force kind of thing, but they generally can because they have quite a lot of sarcomeres in series. And also the kind of pronation angles are slightly different. So the kind of more thoracic region, that normally loses a lot more force the higher you elevate the shoulder and the scapula compared to the lower lat region. So essentially, there's not no force here because there's still some part of a moment arm internally and like it's not zero. So there's some leverage, but also we got to think about some of the passive elements as well. We always, for some reason, with length tension relationship especially, is we just focus on active elements, and then we'll go, well, okay, there's not enough data, and which there isn't enough data in the lats, to be honest. So I could also be wrong on this a little bit, but I'm willing to double down that there's still some force being produced at a moderate level for certain areas of the lats, especially the lower lat lumbar region. And so then another good example of this is then the triceps, right? So we've all seen the Mayo study, get overhead, grow all three heads, right? And yet we have the Colline paper that says, well, actually activation is better where the internal moment arm length is longest, which is in the neutral position and down here. And we see that actually overhead position creates greater hypertrophy than the push down position. So why is that? And again, it comes back to the activation force, but also in this position here, there is a way where actually we could have negative consequences to tricep growth, and that is going at too long of a muscle length. So again, in terms of the internal leverage, actually the longest muscle length for a tricep would actually reduce the amount of force that it could produce. And so that's why you see your reps just fucking decay in the overhead press if you like go super deep stretch. And so that's where I kind of disagree with like the Renaissance gang and Mike Israetel and Jeff Nippert and all those guys, is actually you don't want the deep stretch for the triceps. They operate on the plateau and that's it really. Like, so that's where you can still get good tricep growth in the neutral push down position as well, but generally speaking we don't get super deep muscle lengths in a push down, right? We don't let that cable kind of pull us past 90 degrees a lot of times. So actually that's where the length tension relationship is generally optimized, is in around that 90-degree elbow position. So again, these little things are like again, I know you asked about like kind of isolation and compounds in a sense, but essentially in the same movement itself, even in an isolation, we can actually reduce the maximal activity of the muscle and it will have complete negative consequences because we're still developing tension, but muscles that won't necessarily respond to stretch-mediated hypertrophy, like the triceps, there's just no point in actually taking them to the lengthened position or the deep lengthened position. And so I don't know if you probably do Muscle Mechanics Lab, Jared McMahon, right? Like, he claims to have invented lengthened partials.
Yeah.
I know he didn't invent them because people in the 90s and stuff like that were doing these lengthened partials in bodybuilding and training, but he was the first one to research them, at least in the quads and the elbow flexors and extensors. And so he'll talk about where it's not about being the lengthened position, is not about being the deep stretch and super lengthened, but there is an optimal length, and it generally biases towards longer muscle lengths. So there's this optimal partial lengthened position. And so it's normally not the shorter end of the stack for most muscles. And so again, when it comes to like things like the triceps, when it probably comes to things like the lats, hamstrings actually do operate on a little bit more of a longer length, so they do get stretch mediated hypertrophy. But all these muscles we can start to then categorize where it's like actually there is probably a length, an optimal length where we can train in. And then I think the full range of motion, right, cover that length. So that's why we generally see good adaptations in full range of motion. But maybe we don't maximize the time under maximal mechanical tension with full range of motion, if that makes sense.
So when you're saying, I just want to clarify, when you say stretch-mediated hypertrophy, are you purely talking about sarcomerogenesis, or are there other forms of stretch-mediated hypertrophy like biofibrillar, but just from stretch-mediated from stretch training kind of thing?
Yeah, so essentially, like stretch mediated hypertrophy, I'm talking about like that longer length, and it's going to be more kind of passive tension elements that we're seeing. Eccentrics can play a small role in sarcomerogenesis, like it's very small, like 2-3% changes sort of thing. But I think in that in itself actually is a bit of a confusing thing that people in the science-based lifting world think that training at longer muscle lengths and doing eccentrics means sarcomerogenesis. It actually doesn't. Like you need like really high passive tension, so it's got to be long lengthened isometrics or stretch for real long durations. So essentially, in these positions, either these longer muscle lengths, like that's not the only adaptation that's happening. You mentioned about myofibrillar hypertrophy, radial hypertrophy, right? We're going to get those elements too, and that's where actually eccentrics can contribute to that adaptation. And there's a couple of studies that exist out there that do that. But the thing that I would say with again, training at these longer muscle lengths, having eccentrics in, things like that, sarcomerogenesis is reversible. So not only do we see sarcomeres added in series, but we also see changes in pronation angle of a muscle that come alongside that. And generally we see a lot more changes in pronation angle when we do eccentrics. And what pronation angle gives us the opportunity to do is, one, train across a larger muscle length with greater amount of force. And it also allows us to create that greater amount of force. So basically, if we don't include these things in our training, these things are actually reversible. So I don't think that the role of eccentrics is sarcomerogenesis. It's actually the maintenance of it. It's giving it enough dose to maintain fascicle lengths and pronation angles and muscle cross-sectional area. Concentrics are going to get you a lot more of your myofibrillar growth. We've seen that. But that's because there's some limitations in terms of how much force we can produce in an eccentric contraction, because we need accentuated eccentrics or we need eccentric overload, which the one study that was done in the elbow flexors, I'm forgetting the authors, I think it might have been Mayo's group actually, when they did some tempo load match, they actually showed the least responsive was the concentric group. Now, there's a whole another kind of thought process around tempo and time under tension, right? Where like it, again, I could probably go on a tangent with this one, but there's a lot of misconceptions in terms of what time under tension is, and the methods that we use to quantify it are probably not the best. So what I normally say is, coming full circle back to the length and partial thing, is if there is an optimal range of fascicle length behavior, and we kind of like try and stay within this bandwidth of where the joint torques are maximized with this fiber force, then what we're going to get is the best response, in a sense, for hypertrophy. And so we might not need to go too deep, or we might not need to go too short. And so kind of stay in this like contracted position. And what that's going to give us is the most time under tension in terms of time under high mechanical tension.
Right.
Whereas if we did a full range of motion tempo, we're going to get more time under tension, but less time under
meaningful
the maximal.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's where I think that, like, again, full range of motion training can get you a long way. But then when people switch to these length and partials and Milo Wolf's group and things like that, they see these like, oh, look, my muscles are growing. Yeah. It's, again, because they're hitting that portion of the curve where they are still getting that optimal range, but they're actually probably fatiguing themselves by being in such a deep stretch for certain muscles.
Because they're passing through that range at the end of the rep, presumably, or nearing the end of the rep. So that beginning stage of the rep might just be causing more fatigue without as much stimulus, is what you're arguing. So
yeah, and then if you want me to just one more point on that. So that's where I think like eccentrics do contribute to the sarcomerogenesis, is the fact that generally speaking, when people do eccentric focused training, they go as deep as they possibly can, and then they hold there a lot of times, right? So they kind of like have at least a pause in the isometric. So I think that's where you see some of these things that happen. Nordic hamstring curls is probably another good example where you do see sarcomeres added in series with Nordics, because it's such a difficult lengthening exercise. But then actually at the like longest muscle length in a sense, there isn't that much tension because people just flop sort of thing. So at some point there's like that stretch at the hip, they normally bend a little more, and as the knees bend, so there's this like point of like breaking point where they have the highest amount of fiber forces and a lot of passive tension, especially around the hip. So that's where I think they see sarcomerogenesis happen there.
Yeah, my only criticism of that that I can think of is that it seems like you're having to like trade so much fatigue just for that amount of stimulus. Where this is where like long length, like yielding isometrics come in for me. Like I'm a big proponent for anybody who's really trying to max out like sarcomerogenesis. I would say like do like a yielding isometric in a lengthened position, because I feel like if your goal with the exercise is to stimulate sarcomerogenesis, and you are spending a lot of time in that deep stretch position doing a quasi isometric a couple of times during that set, it just seems to be more beneficial to me to just stay in that position the whole time and just do that set for that stimulus and then do other sets for different kinds of stimulus. But I'm just curious how you feel about that.
Yeah, the one thing that I would say about that is, as much as it's really effective stimulus, it also comes with quite a lot more of a fatigue ratio as well. So we often like put eccentrics as the bad boy of contractions in terms of muscle damage, but actually we can get quite a lot of high muscle damage in terms of the longer lengthened isometric positions, and that's generally it comes a lot more in like newer lifters. So this is where I like generally with my volumes of isometrics for novices is they get a little bit, but they don't do it too much because one, their stretch mediated ion channels are normally a little bit wider, so they'll actually create a lot more calcium ion fatigue and things like that, and they'll have a lot more phosphate buildup and hydrogen buildup, even from just the isometrics. So there is some tolerance and there is some repeated bout effect that can come from it, so you have to train it. And again, as you get sarcomerogenesis happening, it's going to help mitigate some of these things. But again, people like think isometrics and they think non-damaging. It is once you've kind of like accumulated volumes and once you've become less amenable to fatigue, and again, those stretch ion channels will slightly narrow the more and more adaptations you get. So that's part of like the repeated bout effect. So when, again, let's pretend somebody's never lifted before in their life. I actually probably wouldn't do yielding isometrics. I would just do quick, sharp, overcoming ones and keep the durations really, really short. We're going to get them a stimulus high MVT, but we're not going to get that too much volume, and then we could build the volume over time.
So, yeah, so this actually leads me to one of my like biggest confusions with sarcomerogenesis, because the biggest like study I find like most people parroting is like the bird study. That's no pun intended, by the way. But like you're familiar with the paper on the bird wings, right? Where like you passively stretch them. But the amount of stretching that it required in order to experience sarcomerogenesis, even in a small animal like bird wings, was like equivalent to hours a week of stretches in humans. So I find it to be really confusing when a lot of influencers will talk about like static stretching being all you need to maximize hypertrophy, because I feel like there's like literally no evidence to suggest that that's true at all, even remotely true, at least from what I looked into.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yes and no. Like, I don't think there is as much evidence in just like, oh, go and stretch in the gym for a little bit and get sarcomerogenesis. Where I guess like again, some people have misinterpreted this stuff is most of the sarcomerogenesis effects, or the highest effects, like the highest percentages that we see in changes of that muscle limb, is basically from limb immobilization in a stretch position. So you are spending hours and hours upon your day in that specific position, and that's going to get you the greatest amount. And then we see that there's smaller factors of doing stretch under load, like your isometrics, holding passive stretches for long durations, like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 minutes, and doing multiple sets. The thing is, nobody ain't got no time for that. You know what I mean? So like, unless like you do really enjoy that sort of stuff, but you're not wasting all your day doing that thing. So generally speaking,
imagine the fatigue is not worth it too.
Yeah, for sure. So like again, like we get a little bit from our long length isometrics and our eccentrics, and that's probably enough to make significant changes, especially I think more so the fascicle behavior and the pronation angle are more important factors, at least for me, because then they actually transfer those qualities to your concentric actions as well. And the fact that then more sarcomeres in series allows us to lift over a larger length and larger range of motion, which that kind of annoys me sometimes, actually. And this, again, sorry to go on a tangent, but like when people say range of motion is arbitrary, because it's like, no, actually range of motion is like our best way of quantifying some of like the adaptations in a sense, because we want to train in certain given ranges. So we want to put some constraints on that sometimes. So it's not arbitrary as such, because the muscle itself will respond to specific ranges of motion. Again, we go back to that length and partial versus short and partial. The short and partial is always going to lose for pretty much the majority of every single muscle. Maybe brachioradialis, if I can think of one off the top of my head. You might see a bit more gains in the short and partial position, in the contracted position, but there isn't that many other muscles that operate the same way as the brachioradialis does.
So would you say it's more like range of motion dependent or joint angle dependent, if anything? Because like, is it about the actual range of motion or more just the position that the joint is in?
Combination of both. Okay. Because again, if we go back to our lat example, right, and we just purely trained adduction down here, like, yeah, we're going to get some fiber force, but not all of those fascicles are going to be maximized. It actually seems to be like more the 90-degree position where we could maximize that thing, which then again, neuromechanical matching, be in these ranges, whatever. But that doesn't mean that these ranges aren't going to get us any force either. But like certain musculature, again, it's going to depend on how elevated the shoulder is, how rotated my arm is, the wrist forearm position. So it all depends on the specific makeup of the muscle itself. So again, I always default to like biceps and the elbow flexors because it's just really easy, because it's kind of like a straight up and down type of line of action and pull, and the fascicle lines are that way. But then when we think about the lats, right, like they kind of like fan out like this, and it's got a lot of attachments across the spine. So even like a little bit of lateral flexion, and then let's go into superthoracic extension, can limit some of the fiber force that's created for the lats. So I'm actually going to make a post on this hopefully tomorrow, like perfecting my flap position. But essentially, we want to keep as much neutral spine as we can. So we don't want to be laterally rotated. We don't want to be laterally flexed, and we don't want to go into too much lumbar or thoracic extension or flexion. So we want to kind of almost be like sat upright in a sense and stay as neutral as possible, because otherwise we're going to see some dampening effects on how much the fibers can produce, because they have a little bit of role in controlling the spine in those actions as well. So torsional rotation and things. So that's where, again, range of motion is and joint position kind of go hand in hand in a sense, because I could do all of this range of motion here, but if I'm like laterally flexed, now I'm actually getting a little bit less fiber force. And it might feel like, oh yeah, my muscles really contracted, I can feel the lats, but it's because they're being kind of pulled that way, and it's not contributing to potentially growth. Now, again, we don't have outcome studies and we don't have data to like really hone into that, so it's a bit more of a theoretical model and some open sim modeling, but that's generally what the fascicle behavior acts like. So both for me are important aspects: joint position and then the range of motion that you're lifting through.
Yeah, I also find it to be a little bit ideologically inconsistent to assume that there are motor units in the lats that are exclusive for adduction and exclusive to extension, but we wouldn't assume that there are motor units in the lats that are exclusive in these more overhead positions compared to lower. I don't know if that's sound logic or not.
Yeah, and again, we just don't have like the data, right? Because generally speaking, when people do the surface EMG of the lats, it's a really thin muscle. So there's a real high potential for crosstalk, and especially based on location. And a lot of times people just kind of plunk the EMG sensors at the middle. And so we'd be naive to think that the fascicles, because there is a lot of fascicles and sarcomerogenesis series in the lats, that those middle ones reflect the behavior of the distal and proximal fibers as well. So again, there's going to be some like length and tension changes. And so even in like muscles like the biceps, which are easier, again, I'll go back to them, there's certain times where like the fascicle actually doesn't change length at all, and it just acts isometrically, even in a dynamic contraction. So now we transfer that to the lats, right? Like, all right, there's some EMG activity here, but how did we not know that down here might be 10-15% higher innervation rate sort of thing? So it's not like regional activation in a sense, but there's probably more fiber force happening somewhere else. And then the other thing is, like, some of these upper thoracic regions, I think, are getting the teres in there a little bit based on what looks like their observation of the placement. So this is where we need, again, like fine wire and things like that. And we need somebody to do, I think there was actually a study I read the other day that was on pull down, which actually did the full range of motion of a pull down. So we've got a little bit more data now past this kind of 120-degree elbow angle, but it also depends if they did wide or not. I can't remember in the specific position. So we just need more data on these things to really fully kind of make a judgment call. Because again, I could absolutely hold my hand up and be, I think that my way's right. But like if data comes out and they say, oh, actually, no, this is the true lat activity and lats totally drop off, and the muscle fiber forces, it goes way past its descendant limb or ascendant limb, I'm up for that. Like I'm really amenable to accepting that I'm wrong. But again, if I hypothesize right now and I was able to set the study up, which I'm trying to work with a couple of people to do something like this, I do think that there's still contribution of a certain area, and especially the lumbar region of the lats, especially the higher up that we go.
I don't know where you're doing it, dude, but I would be a participant if you need it.
Yeah, and that's the thing is right now I just got to get a lab to collaborate with, so I'm speaking to a couple of local professors to see if we can get some stuff done. But it also depends if they're interested in this area and they want to do this kind of stuff too. But it's one of those. There's probably somebody somewhere doing the study. Jared Backman's another one where I'm trying to kind of inception him to get some of his grad students to do some of this work as well, because he has the lab and the ability to do it. So I'm pretty sure we'll see some more collaborations. But we're trying to put our narrative review on neuromechanical matching out first before we do anything else.
Yeah, I'm excited for his videos on length and partials too, because I know he said he was going to drop some stuff explaining how he would properly implement them. And I think that's something that we need direly in this industry right now. But the last question I want to ask you in this episode is if you had to pick one innovation in research methods that we need in order to have a clearer picture of hypertrophy, at least in the TikTok sphere, what do you think the biggest advancement we can make in the future?
Yeah, I think it would be, and this is happening. So there's some really cool things that are happening in biomechanics with the simulation models and being able to account for not only fascicles being kind of in this like straight line, but like the actual kind of like concaveness of them in a sense, like the changes when they do get squashed together, accounting for rotational forces in models and things. Because there's certain like principles that generally get applied to these like measuring moment arms and things like that, measuring fascicle length, and it comes from cadavers, and they put them through different passive ranges of motion and all these stuff, and then we build the simulation. So I think eventually being able to actually like simulate these in almost like 3D in a sense, and account for what would be rotational joint torques and rotational muscle torques and things, and it's happening already. And then I think then like probably better ways and more assessments, to be honest, and the technology technically exists, but just doing EMG activity in a bit more like spread areas of a sense of certain muscles, looking at synergies. People who already have done some of this work, but I think it's then one will complement the other with the ability to then simulate these models a little bit better and estimate these things. Ultimately, a simulation is always going to be wrong, and a model is always going to be wrong. It's just how wrong it is, kind of thing. And then the other thing that I think will help us immensely is if somebody does a neuromechanical matching study, because I think that would essentially just either quieten one side of the argument or provide strength of evidence. And then again, I would love, like, I don't know if this ever comes across in my content, but I would love for neuromechanical matching to actually be the reason for muscular activation, because then that gives us such a logical way of training specific muscles in specific ranges. And like when you have a weak point and I want to go and train biceps, whoop, you know what I'm saying? I want to go and I want to go and hit my lats. Here we go. Nice and easy. You know what I'm saying? Like we can make guesses and we can make some educated guesses right now. And again, I don't think that relative leverage is going to be the answer based on my understanding of just muscle mechanics in general. But it would be nice, right? That would be a nice outcome. But ultimately, we won't know until people do more studies. So that also links into the modeling of the EMG stuff, because then we can do that more effectively through getting those methods out there.
Yeah, and I think we'd both probably be out of a job if neuromechanical matching turned out to be true.
You just hit chat GPT, write me my neuromechanical matching program, and we're out. And that's the thing, right? And that's where, again, I don't think anything's ever going to be perfect in these situations, because there's always going to be nuance and response and genetic freaks. Like I've been fortunate enough in my career to work with like some of the craziest genetic freaks in the basketball world, right? These guys are 7 feet, 6'10", can do stride lengths that are like twice the size of mine, fast, quick, agile. And so these are exceptions to the training norms where like a maximal strength training program might be actual detrimental to their performance and things. So there's all these like little bits of nuance that, again, the art of coaching, I don't think will ever die. I don't think we can ever really truly get replaced by AI. What I think AI can help us do is understand some of these things better, because I'll know, and this is no disrespect to some of my colleagues out there, but like I'll have conversations and they have no idea what the length tension relationship is, but they're coaching athletes. So it's like, you know, say like eventually AI. I mean, you'll be surprised.
Really?
There's people out there like that wouldn't, if you ask them to explain the length tension relationship, they probably wouldn't be able to give you an answer. And that's the scary part of the field of strength conditioning, is that level of kind of understanding doesn't always exist, which is kind of crazy to think about. And then we have the whole dilemma of social media experts, whatever we want to call them, right? That also don't have necessarily all of the foundational understanding. I think that like the one thing I always think about, right, is who was I 10 years ago? Who was I 10 years before that? Right? Like at one point, I didn't even know how to pee standing up, if you know what I'm saying. So it's kind of like same thing with like learning in science, right? Like you can get really, really good and become an expert in one area, but there's a whole lot of science out there. And so some of the questions today, like on motor learning aspects and things, I'm not the right expert to answer those. I have a surface level understanding. I'm sure if an expert listened to what I said, they might be like, Craig's wrong. This is actually the real reason. And that's where like I think like there's good conversations that come out of that. Where I kind of like get a little bit like annoyed in a sense is when there is the social media expert who just regurgitates what they've read on a blog or Patreon, an infographic or things like that, because like they haven't gone and tried to understand the other side of the argument. Essentially for everyone out there, right? Like the big message of what I teach my students and what I speak to when I'm mentoring people is when you have strong beliefs in a certain area, like your biases are going to make you research the evidence for that belief, right? So what I generally challenge people to do is actually go and do the counter. Actually try and create an argument that says this doesn't exist or this challenges my beliefs. And what you'll actually find is then you do start living in the gray a lot more, because you will find a paper, you will find a different consensus, you'll find something that actually contrasts that. And so the only reason that you can lean one way or the other is when a lot of evidence stacks in that way, or we can 100% say the mechanism or something else exists. Otherwise, you kind of have to live in the gray.
And sometimes spending some time trying
to prove yourself.
I was going to say, sometimes trying to like spend some time proving yourself wrong is what ends up affirming your philosophy in the first place, and you could realize with even more conviction that the way you believe, the way you were feeling was actually accurate.
100%. Again, like as a coach, right? Look back at your programs that you wrote last year, the year before, when you're 10 years down the line. Look at your programs from 10 years ago, and you'll realize that you were kind of wrong, but in that time, and you were right. Out finding again the things that work, the outcomes, the mechanisms, they all combine into one. But whenever somebody has such strong beliefs in one area, I'm always willing to play devil's advocate as well. Like even if I actually believe what they believe too, because let's challenge other thought, right? Because we all create biases, and the more bias we get, the more likely we're not going to accept that there's another part of the puzzle in a sense. So as much as that's a bit of a philosophical stoic type thing there, that's my last 2 cents.
All right, well, that wraps up for today's episode. Thank you to Dr. Craig for diving into the details. Do you want to drop your socials for anybody?
Yeah, for sure. So you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, the Science-Based Lifter. For some reason on TikTok, it's the Science-D-Based Lifter. TikTok did me dirty on that one. And yeah, if anybody reaches out. I generally try and respond to every comment. I try and respond to DMs and things like that. So fairly active. Again, just pushing out some decent content and hopefully educating others.
All right. Well, if you're into evidence-based training and want the nuance behind what actually drives hypertrophy, stick around. That's what the show's about.